the most delicate thing I have ever laid my hands on. That is a really nice display. It's just comically small. Very carefully trim a certain amount off the side. A separate stereo audio socket. Terrifying to do. I'd have the lights flashing. Careful work with a needle file. It was an excuse to have a load of wires going here, there, and everywhere. Hardwood buttons with switches and wires and lights. It's just fun. I just like doing stuff like this. This is the first Game Boy console that I ever actually modded. I did it in 2012 and I did it entirely using parts that I'd salvaged from a Game Boy Advance SP. It was absolutely terrifying to do. It was difficult to get any reference on how to do it, and there wasn't really anywhere I could buy any new parts. But I've still got it today and it still works great. And this is my latest modded Nintendo Game Boy console, although it's not actually a Nintendo Game Boy console. This entire thing is built from new non-Nintendo parts, but it runs Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. Now, both of these have got their merits, of course, but there is 12 years of difference between these two builds and a whole load of weird and wonderful mods that I've learned how to do or figured out how to do during the years between. Now, over the past few weeks, to raise funds for a new laptop for doing some editing on, I've been selling a few Game Boy consoles on my Instagram page. And while I was digging through the boxes of consoles that I've built over the years, it made me appreciate just what an exciting time that was, as Game Boy modification was becoming more and more popular. So today we're going to have a little bit of a history lesson. I've got this box of weird and wonderful consoles to give you a bit of a tour of, and what I've tried to do is pick out a selection where the modifications were very much out of necessity or curiosity or just for fun. But what I really want to get across in this video by showing you these consoles is just how you can innovate and create with what you've got. We are very fortunate now. There are so many ways of being able to get hold of new parts to repair or restore or upgrade your classic handhelds. There are countless screens, shells, lenses, button sets. You can create anything that you can visualize, and you can get hold of the parts to do it, and you can do it in a number of different ways. But back when I started modding these handhelds, it was a very different story. First of all, there were companies selling replacement buttons or screen backlights and so on, but you could only get those from the USA. There weren't actually any UK distribution, so I had to order from overseas. And when I wanted to build this, I was getting a little impatient. I didn't want to be waiting weeks for things to be delivered. So I did a little bit of digging around on how I could take a more DIY approach. And I learned that with the Game Boy Color, because the screen is kind of front reflective, it's designed to be in daylight. It needed a front light to shine on it. And I found some tutorials that allowed you to take out the front light from a Game Boy Advance SP and transplant it into this console. But a Game Boy Advance screen is kind of like a horizontal rectangle, and the Game Boy Color is a little bit more square. So the way of installing it that was recommended at the time was to take that front light and turn it on its side. There's actually a bit more front light inside here that's masked off, and one of the things that always bothered me about this one when I first did it is that it's lit from the side. It's lit very evenly. I've seen various other front light kits for these sort of screens, and they often involved using messy glue and things like that, but they never really looked any good compared to the SP front lights. Now, installing these front lights is painstaking business. One slight touch on the screen and your fingerprint will be highlighted for all to see. If you get a fingerprint on, you can't really wipe it off because it'll damage the front light panel. So you have to be super careful putting it in there. And I was really pleased. I did a really nice job with it, if I do say so myself, and it's still totally usable now. I'm selling many Game Boys, but I am not selling this one because it was my gateway into a hobby that I absolutely adore. But the side-on front light always bothered me a little bit, and I wanted to work out a way of doing things differently. So a little further down the line, I built this one. Now, this also has a Game Boy Advance front light panel. Honestly, if you've got a Game Boy Advance and the screen is smashed or broken or the LCD's damaged, the front light panel is a separate part. So if you very carefully disassemble, you can salvage that front light and use it for other projects, which is what I did. I went around car boot sales, charity shops, and tried to find as many broken or used or damaged Game Boy Advance consoles as I could, so I could use those front lights in other projects. And that's what I've got here. But this time, the front light is lit up from the bottom, and it's a much more even coverage, and the viewing angles are much better. But to do that, I had to not only remove that front light panel, not only avoid damaging it, avoid touching it, but also very carefully, I had to trim a certain amount off the side so I could fit it inside the console. And mission accomplished. It's really awesome. But compared to the drop-in kits or self-build kits that we can do now, it was quite a challenge. But for that, there's a certain amount of pride and achievement that comes with a build like this. So I would still encourage trying to take a DIY approach wherever it's possible. Now, on top of that, I got into modifying Game Boys for making music on them and performing at live shows and things like that, where obviously the lighting is quite dim, so a lit up screen is important, but also you connect into a sound system, you want the sound quality to be good. So on this first one that I built, I also did what's known as a Pro Sound mod, where you bypass the headphone amplifier to get a direct stereo line out, and in this case it connects directly to the headphone socket. On this one I added a separate stereo audio socket onto the side here, and I also added some capacitors to the inside to get, I can't remember now whether it was a noise filter mod or a bass boost mod, but the sound on the Game Boy Color compared to the original Game Boy is a little bit weak in terms of bass, so there are some sound modifications that you can do. And again, just some standard electronic components soldered in the right position changes the whole machine. So that's Game Boy Color, but I also transplanted one of the front light panels into a Game Boy Advance. Again, before the AGS 101 screens came along for modifying these, before you could use IPS screens or anything like that, the Game Boy Advance was very difficult to see. And the screen on this is exactly the same size as the one in the Game Boy Advance SP. So I took a very similar approach to what I've done with this one here. Harvested a front light from a Game Boy Advance SP and very, very carefully attached it and soldered it inside this one. And again, it works pretty well. You can see that there's a slight distortion to the lighting, but you know, compared to the screen in the Game Boy Advance that was not lit at all, having the front light made quite a difference. So that was early days, and it was ways to modify a console without actually having to buy any specific parts to update it. But then I did start placing orders overseas, and I started to get my hands on some backlight kits and some button sets, but still the urge to recycle and reuse existing parts was strong, and the urge to think of new creative different ways of doing things was still there. So this is one of my early DMG builds, and I actually used this one at my first chiptune gig, and I'll show you why in a moment. But again, I just wanted to be creative and try and innovate a little bit with this. I went for this pink and yellow color scheme, but the front was actually from a gray DMG. So if I show you here, you'll see that the logo is visible on the front, and that's just because I did a thin coat of a sort of fluorescent yellow onto the grey shell. It's worn a little bit on the edges, but it's weathered pretty well, to be honest, and it looks good being able to see the logo. Also, I used a clear lens over the top so that the yellow is kind of continuous across the front of it. It looks really effective. Now, if I switch on, it's got a backlit biverted display. And it looks really nice. Having the bivert, see, this is another thing. You would buy a hex chip which will invert a signal, and you wire it up to the console and it inverts the display. It makes it back to front. It makes it so that the darks are light and the lights are dark. But you can also put a polarizing film over the top of the lens, and if you rotate that 90 degrees, that does the same thing. So by doing that twice, you are inverting it twice, and you bivert it, which means you end up with the same display, which sounds like it'd be a redundant thing, it'd be a waste of time, but it makes the image much crisper, much sharper. And in terms of trying to modify the original LCD, it did make a significant improvement. And you can get those in various different colors, just depending on the color of the LEDs in the panel that you would install. To install the panels was really, really tricky. You would have to peel off the reflective film inside the LCD itself without damaging the screen, and then carefully feed this extra panel inside with the filter, and then wire up a couple of solder points inside. I did many of these, and sometimes the screen would fail on you and it would be heartbreaking because you couldn't just buy a new screen kit like you can now. It was just dead. But this one is still going strong, and having the pink backlight with the pink buttons and everything else looked quite good. But I didn't just use a grey shell. I also used the back half of a clear shell, again taken from an existing broken Game Boy, cleaned it up, and inside here I wired up a bunch of LEDs, and that's why we got this big toggle switch on top. And when you click that, it starts a load of RGB LEDs flashing. So when I was actually playing, I'd have the lights flashing. It wasn't in time to the music as such, but I bought these RGB flashing LEDs that flash at different rates, going from fast to slow. It just looked really effective. So a fun mod to do, and it was great for a live show. And the fact that you can switch it on or off while the Game Boy is running means you can use it for a bit and then you can switch on the LEDs. So Yeah, and again, another quirky build of mine that I can't bear to part with. I've got these kind of nostalgic attachments to some, and despite having a huge collection and trying to get um, to part with some of it, there's some things I just need to keep hold of. Another favorite of mine, and one that I am parting ways with very soon, but it is going to a good home, is this one here. Two things I did with this. One, I got a clear shell. It was an aftermarket shell, but the availability of colors of the different shells you could get wasn't that wide at the time. So what I did was I got some teal blue spray paint and actually painted inside the shell. So you mask off the outside and you spray paint all of the inside, and it gives a really nice finish. You get this distinctive kind of industrial look by being able to see all the screw posts and the extra bits of plastic that are mounted in there with the mold. But also, unlike this one where it's painted onto the surface, no matter how much you use this, the paint isn't going to wear off. So it still looks absolutely pristine now. Now, another thing you might notice is this. Look at that. I made some hardwood buttons using some existing Game Boy buttons, sanded them down flat to take the top surface off, got some thin veneer of, I think it's Iroko, and laser cut that into circles and glued them onto the buttons, varnished them, mounted them in the Game Boy, and it's awesome. I love this Game Boy. I thought it looked amazing at the time, and I still love it now. It's got a mirror finish lens around the screen, and again, it's got one of those backlit biverted screens. This one is in white. Let's just pop some batteries in. So installing these bivert chips just created a really nice sharp contrast. You can see every pixel on there. It just looks really, really nice. So yeah, the bivert, and again, it was an excuse to have a load of wires going here, there, and everywhere, and do a load of soldering on the PCB. I love stuff like that. Eventually, you could get like easy bivert chips, which would solder to a few little points on the board, but that kind of took the fun out of it for me. Oh, and one more thing about this one. I mentioned about the Pro Sound mods before. I actually took out the power supply board from the inside and relocated it over on this side by trimming it down, which left space for a huge 1/4-inch stereo audio socket. Let's get that in focus for you. So there is this massive audio socket in the bottom, so you can put a full 1/4-inch audio lead, studio audio lead in there to connect up for your sound. So that's like a guitar lead size one, but obviously it's got the stereo signal, so you plug that in there and it does exactly the same thing as that socket. So why I did it? Just because I could, I suppose. It's just fun. I just like doing stuff like this. Okay, so those LCD kits, the backlight panels that you could install in the DMG, were also compatible with the Game Boy Pocket. But the thing about the Game Boy Pocket, now this one here works. Can you see just down the side? It's got like the weird blue bits. That's just where sometimes the layers of the display separate slightly and the liquid crystal kind of bleeds and creeps across a little bit. It looks kind of cool, but yeah, it can creep in and destroy the display. But this has been like this for years, and it's fine. And the display on the Game Boy Pocket looked amazing with these. So why was everyone still using DMGs? Because these screens were like the most delicate thing I have ever laid my hands on. You'd be very, very carefully taking them out, and you'd only have to look at it, and all of a sudden it'd be like gone, and the layers would separate, and you'd have no display. And again, no way of fixing it. So it was, yeah, it was intense stuff doing these mods at that time. And unfortunately, sometimes some things did go by the wayside. Now, I am very, very glad that I kept a lot of this stuff. I am a bit of a hoarder, and I kept lots and lots of these parts, even though they ended up going faulty. And I know that a lot of people at the time just kind of got rid of them or sold them on as broken or spare parts. But now that there are new bits that you can buy, entire new replacement front PCBs with screens attached and everything else, those old parts are still coming in handy. So I'm glad I kept hold of them at the time. I think with these, even though now you can get the really, really, really nice IPS screens, with this, you still have the original LCD. You can just see it better. So it's much more authentic to the original Game Boy experience. So there's still a lot to be said for these backlight panels. They're just much, much more work to install than the new IPS kits, but they are cheaper. Right, swapping some batteries out again. Now, with all this talk of inserting these panels and dismantling the original screens to get them backlit and the new modern IPS kits, there's got to have been a changeover point at some time, right? Well, yeah, and this is kind of it. This is the first replacement screen that I put into a DMG. Now, these didn't hang around for long, and you'll see why when I switch it on. The display is tiny. It's so small. But it's really nice. It's crisp. It's black and white. And at the time, it was really, really exciting to see. Let's just get a better focus there. That is a really nice display. It's just comically small. And when I've done builds like this and technology moves on, it is tempting to take these things apart, salvage the bits and put them together. But I think this is very much of a very swift era that was of a changeover that happened very quickly and then went away again. So I think of a bit of history, I'd rather keep it together as it is. Speaking of history, take a look at the buttons on this. So these are not plastic buttons. Now, underneath a Game Boy's buttons, you tend to have a silicon membrane, which is what makes the contact on the PCB. Now, these buttons are actually made of silicon. I bought them through Kitch-Bent a few years ago, which is an American reseller of Game Boy modification parts. They've got this kind of cool swirly pattern on them. But when I put a picture of it up on my Instagram, I got a message from my friend Anderugo. So these buttons were originally made as an exclusive for Breakfest, which was a chiptune festival. They were only given out to people who attended the show, so they're actually pretty rare. So, not only have we got a very scarce replacement screen, but we've got some rare buttons in here as well. So yeah, with this one, it was a reproduction white shell. It was quite easy to get your hands on the repro shells by this point, and I put a pink power switch in there to match the pink on these. The touch, the feel of these silicon buttons is actually really nice. It's very, very different to the original Game Boy buttons, so you may or may not like those, but certainly as an aesthetic, it's cool, isn't it? Now, although we now have a wealth of replacement parts at our disposal to upgrade our Game Boys, there's a few areas that are still lacking a little bit and still a few opportunities for DIY. One of my most recent completely DIY installations was this here, okay? So we've got a Game Boy Advance SP, okay, we've seen these before. But on the side of the screen here, I've got a stereo headphone socket. See, because although the SP is a great console, it hasn't got a headphone port. They were way ahead of Apple with the iPhone there, weren't they? But we've got this attached on the side. Now, the thing about this is the screen in here is a replacement IPS screen. Now, although it is newer, more modern, although the display is bigger than the original SP screen, the actual unit, the screen unit, is slightly smaller, which means there is a tiny little gap in this area here, which means there was room for me to squeeze, and it was a tight squeeze, a headphone socket into this area here with some very, very careful work with a needle file. I managed to get that in place, solder it up to the motherboard, and now this is a console with a headphone socket or an audio line out socket. So there are still opportunities out there for a completely DIY approach just using electronic components. And that's pretty much it in terms of these weird modifications, but there's just one more thing I wanted to leave you with. While I was rummaging through my boxes of Game Boys, I also uncovered this. This is the BittBoy. Now, it doesn't look like much, and to be honest, playing with it, it doesn't really play like much now, but this was the start of that whole revolution of these kind of emulator consoles that are so popular now. So if we look at something like my Miu Mini Plus, which is a hugely capable little machine, this came along 5 years after the BittBoy, and you can see that there's some heritage there. This still has a lot going for it. It's obviously got that Game Boy aesthetic. It's got an internal rechargeable battery. It's got a color backlit screen. You can install an SD card in the top that we've got here to put your own games on, and it'll run various games on various emulators for Game Boy Color, Game Gear, and you can try and push it a little bit towards later consoles, but it struggles when it gets to Super Nintendo and so on. This was the start of something big. If you jump on YouTube now and look at handheld game consoles, the market is massive. There is something new coming out every week with these things, and this is kind of where it all started. It's also funny that since digging this out during this week and having another go on it, I woke up this morning and on my Google News feed there was actually a new article about the fact that this was kind of celebrating its 5-year anniversary and did a little bit of a revisit into it. So I'll try and remember to link that in the description so you can take a look and read a little bit more about this awesome little, very, very pocket-sized piece of kit. So yeah, we really have come a long way from all of these different DIY mods. I love all the exploration. I love that whole mad professor approach with switches and wires and lights everywhere. It's just a lot of fun. But at the same time, I am in awe of where we are now, that I can buy a kit with all brand new parts that builds a beautiful Game Boy that functions really well and plays all of my existing classic games. So if that's got you fired up for getting into modding, there is now, as I say, a wealth of hardware that you can get your hands on to upgrade, improve, or even build an entirely new Game Boy console. And if you want to try that out, you do well to check out my affiliate link in the description for Z Labs. They sell so much stuff for that hobby, including the tools and all the parts and buttons and shells and anything else you could want to lay your hands on. So definitely go and check those out. If you follow my link, you'll get yourself a discount on your order as well, and you'll be supporting my channel. So as mentioned earlier, this is my latest build. It is the Funny Playing FPGBC. It's an FPGA console, which means it kind of pretends to be a Game Boy. It's amazing, and I did a video about it recently. It's going down really well. Thank you so much to everyone who's watched it so far. But if you haven't, check it out. It's popping up here. Go and have a look. I think you'll enjoy it. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.